The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Jennifer Schaus, and welcome to our Government Contracting Webinar Series. This is the final week number 10, and the final day in our series. And we are joined today by John Williams, who's going to be discussing sole source contracts for some of the set-asides. A little bit about our webinar series, which actually has concluded, as I mentioned today. You can find all of the recordings on our website, and today's webinars will be listed later this evening or at some point over the weekend. Our library contains over 50 webinars on a variety of topics about government contracting. A little bit about us: we're based in downtown Washington, D.C.
up in that HUBZone map. For HUBZone firms, and it's a certification process, so if you get certified by SBA as a HUBZone firm, then you're eligible for both competitive and sole source HUBZone contracts. And we're going to talk in depth about sole source contracts in a moment. HUBZone program also has a unique benefit in that there's a price evaluation preference of 10% in full and open competition. So if you're a HUBZone firm and you're in a full and open competition and you have a large business competitor for that procurement, as long as your price is within 10% of that large business competitor, you're going to be considered the lower priced proposal because you get this 10% evaluation preference. And HUBZone firms are now eligible for SBA's new mentor protege program. The Mentor Protege program started last year, and it's open to all small businesses. So this is the first time that HUBZone firms can go out and get a mentor and take advantage of all of the things that SBA's Mentor Protege program has to offer. I'm not going to go into detail on Mentor Protege here today, but there was an earlier webinar on Mentor Protege, so I definitely encourage you to learn more about that exciting new SBA program. Just a quick rundown on the eligibility requirements for the HUBZone program. You have to be a small business, of course, like all the other small business programs, and that's based on your primary industry. And you look at your primary industry, the NAICS code, and there's a size standard associated with that NAICS code, and that lets you decide if you're below the size standard, you're small. If you're above the size standard, you're large. HUBZone companies have to be owned and controlled at least 51% by U.S. citizens. And there's some special rules for HUBZone firms owned by tribes and ANCs. Your principal office has to be located in a HUBZone. And the principal office is the location where the greatest number of your employees at any one location perform their work. Now, there's some exceptions for employees who work on job sites, and but generally speaking, that's the way they define principal office, and it needs to be in a HUBZone. The other big requirement for HUBZone is that at least 35% of your employees have to live in a HUBZone. It doesn't have to be the same HUBZone. It doesn't have to be the same HUBZone as your principal office, but you have to have at least 35% of your employees, and that's all of your employees. It's not just employees who work in the office versus job site employees. It's all of your employees, which are defined as people who work on a full-time or part-time or other basis. As long as they're getting 40 hours in a month, they are considered an employee. And there is some pending changes to these requirements on the Hill right now. I think it's going to get into the National Defense Authorization Act for this year. They're considering changing this to 33% from 35%. So the idea is to make it easier for companies to confirm that they're eligible, because 33 would just be 1 out of every 3 people. 35 gives, you end up with fractions of people and you have to round up. So they're trying to make it a little bit easier, and hopefully that'll go through. So HUBZone sole source contracts, I've given you the FAR sites where this is mentioned. It's primarily 19.1306. Contracting officers cannot do a HUBZone sole source contract unless they first determine that the rule of 2 doesn't apply. So if you were on the 8A webinar on sole source, you heard me say that it's such a tremendous advantage for 8A companies because contracting officers don't have to worry about the rule of 2 before they do an 8A sole source. They can just go ahead and do an 8A sole source. That is not the case for HUBZone. So the contracting officer has to determine that there are not at least 2 HUBZone firms that could do the work at a fair and reasonable price. If the contracting officer does find that there are at least 2 HUBZone firms that can do the work, then they can't do a sole source. So they have to find only 1, and then they can do a sole source. But you can be creative here, and this is like something that our firm helps companies with a lot in marketing to the contracting officer, positioning with them how they can support a sole source contract for HUBZone or for SDVO speed. Just to give one example, what you're trying to show something unique about your business that makes you the only one. So there might be other HUBZone firms out there in somewhat overlap with you, but what makes you unique? Maybe you're the only one in your region, or maybe you're the only one with a certain specific type of work or a certain labor category on your contract, or whatever it might be that would allow you to argue, hey, we're the only ones. So you can do a sole source because there's only one that can do this particular type of work. There are the same sole source dollar limits that applied to 8A apply here. So you can't do a sole source HUBZone contract above $7 million for manufacturing contracts or above $4 million for any other type of contract. So you have to stay below these thresholds. A little bit more on HUBZone sole source contracts. If it's already in the 8A program or has been accepted into 8A, then it's not eligible for a HUBZone sole source. It has to be above the simplified acquisition threshold, so you can't do small HUBZone sole source contracts. And the SBA can appeal a contracting officer's decision not to make a sole source award. So I don't know how often you're really going to take advantage of that, but just in theory, it's good to know that if you're really pushing a customer that, look, we're the only HUBZone company that can do this, you can do a sole source award to us, and the customer is just not getting it, you could go to the SBA and ask them to intercede and to appeal that determination. Next, we're going to talk about SDVO-OSB, and I've put VOSB up here because there are two different programs for SDVO-OSBs in the federal government, and that can be a little bit confusing, but the one program is run through the SBA, and the other program is run through the VA. And the key distinction is that the SBA's program is only for SDVO-OSBs, service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses. The VA has a program for both SDVO-OSBs and veteran-owned small businesses, or VOSBs. So, you know, the goals of these programs are to increase the federal government's contracting with veterans and assist them in transition from active duty to civilian life. I think in recent years, the government generally has been doing a good job of getting their goals met on spending to SDVO-OSBs, although that's not the case across the board for all agencies. And you know, there are competitive and sole source contract opportunities here, just like with HUBZone, and just like I mentioned for HUBZone, this new SBA Mentor Protege program is open to SDVO-OSBs, so and all small businesses. So that's really, again, just to keep coming back to that point, we're not going to get into it here, but there's a lot of good information in earlier webinar, and I'm happy to answer questions if you're specifically interested in the Mentor Protege program. Just follow up with me afterwards. Quick overview on eligibility requirements for SDVO-OSB. You know, the rules, because there's two different programs, it can be confusing, you know, that the rules are not identical between the SBA and the VA, so sometimes you run into some squirrely issues in the regs where you may be okay under the SBA's rules, but you're not totally okay under the VA's rules, or vice versa. Congress has recognized this, and the good news is that they told the VA last year to start working with the SBA to start so that they're following the SBA's rules. But that hasn't happened yet. My understanding is the two agencies are working, and there should be some proposed rules coming out hopefully soon. But we're moving in the direction of going under one set of rules at the SBA. We're just not quite there yet. Of course, you have to be a small business, same way you determine that as I talked about for HUBZone. And then, you know, the ownership and management requirements that are listed here are really geared towards making sure that the veteran is in control of the business. That's what they're really looking for at the end of the day, and these are various ways that they will make that determination. Another important distinction between the two different programs is that you have to, if you're going to be in the VA's program, you have to be certified by the VA. So you have to go through an application process, and they're going to look at your company, your documents, etc., and they'll make a decision whether you are eligible to be verified as a VOSB or an SDVO-OSB. And then they will list you. They have a database that's available online where you'll be listed, and you'll have the seal of approval that you've been verified by the VA. The SBA's program is just a self-certification. So you can go into sam.gov, and if you believe that you meet all of the requirements as an SDVO-OSB, you can check the box, say, yes, I'm an SDVO-OSB. Sole source contracts, and I've given you the FAR sites for where you'll, and the VAR, that's the VA's acquisition regulation. So this is where you'll find the source of authority for sole source contracts to SDVO-OSBs and VOSBs. For SBA, it works the same as HUBZone, in that you have to first decide that the rule of 2 is not satisfied before you can do a sole source. So if they find 2 SDVOSBs, they can't do a sole source. They have to do a competitive SDVOSB contract. But once again, you can be creative and and it's all about marketing. Getting sole source contracts is about marketing to your customers. They're not just, the customers aren't just sitting there waiting to give you a sole source contract. You have to market to them and convince them why you're the right candidate in terms of your capabilities, and also why there's legal authority for them to do it. So it's really important to have this information, and that's why I'm giving you the citations, because you want to show them you've done your homework and you know where the authority is, and that the contracting officer has legal authority to do it, and you're trying to help them out. Make it easy for them to issue it, and it'll be easier for them to do it. Strangely, the dollar limits are a little bit different. We mentioned for HUBZone that it's a $7 million and a $4 million cap. For SDVOSB, it's $6.5 million and $4 million. I think that might just be an example of the FAR hasn't been updated for all the programs, but just be aware there is a slight difference there. And another, not a slight difference, a really big difference with the VA program is that their sole source is much more like 8A. At least in the statute, the VA law that created their contracting program, it's often called the Vets First contracting program. That law says that they can do a sole source award to an SDVOSB or a VOSB without having to go through the rule of 2. And the VAR says that as well. Now the limitation is $5 million. It doesn't distinguish between whether it's manufacturing or not. It's just it has to be below $5 million to be a sole source. But they don't have to do the rule of 2 analysis first, which makes it pretty much the same as the 8A sole source, which is a real home run. It's a really great marketing tool for SDVOSBs and VOSBs that are working at the VA. But there's a but on this, which is that the VA has implemented policies and internal procedures that they essentially require their contracting officers to do a justification before they issue the sole source awards. And that justification that's required essentially makes them go through a rule of 2 analysis. So unfortunately, the VA has implemented a policy that effectively undercuts this statutory authority. It's inconsistent with the statutory authority. And that's something that we and others are working to try to change. But just be aware that it's not quite as easy to do sole source at VA as it should be. And lastly, for the WOSB program, we've got here WOSB and EDWOSB, because you could be either a woman-owned small business or an economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business. This program started several years ago, and it did not have, and there was no sole source authority. But there was a big push, and we were a part of that, and fortunately, we got Congress to implement sole source authority for this program a couple of years ago. So I do still find that some contracting officers are not aware that there is sole source authority for WOSBs and EDWOSBs. So again, as part of your marketing and you're educating your customer, it does exist. It's in the FAR. There are no more dollar caps for competitive set-aside contracts. That was a component of the program when it first started. You were limited in the size of contracts you could do for competitive woman-owned contracts, but that doesn't exist anymore. The program is, however, still limited by NAICS code. There are only certain NAICS codes that are available for woman-owned and EDWOSB contracts. And just like all other small businesses, you can get into this new SBA Mentor Protege program I mentioned as a WOSB and EDWOSB. Quickly on the next slide on the eligibility requirements, very similar to the veteran program in terms of it has to be ownership and control, at least 51% by the woman. And if it's going to be an economically disadvantaged woman, then you have to meet economic disadvantage thresholds that are very similar to the 8A disadvantage thresholds. And like I said, you have to be in the right NAICS code, and of course you have to be small. And finally, to talk about sole source contracts for WOSBs and EDWOSBs. I've given you the FAR site here, so if you have to try to convince a contracting officer that doesn't realize they can do a sole source to a WOSB, show them that FAR site. They can absolutely do it. They have legal authority to do it. They do first have to determine that the rule of 2 is not satisfied, though. So this works just like HUBZone and SDVOSB at the SBA, where you have to first cross off the rule of 2, which means you're going to need to market and maybe be creative with your customer. And if there's a will, there's a way. That's what I always say. If they're willing to do it, you give them the good ammo, you make their life easy, they can do it, and they have the authority to do it. It's got to be in the right NAICS code, of course, and you can find those NAICS codes easily online, which are available for WOSB and EDWOSB. And we've got limitations, just like all other sole source contracts. Can't be over $6.5 million for manufacturing or $4 million for any other type of contract.
Thanks, John, for the great information on the sole source contracts. This session has been recorded. And just to let everybody know, some of the items that John spoke about today, the rule of 2, simplified acquisitions, 8A sole source contracts are all webinars that we have done in the past. You can find those on our website under the webinar section. That we also do have a YouTube channel that has all of the webinars. Thanks again, John. If anybody has questions about sole source contracts or any government contracting matters, you can contact John at the phone number listed or by email. John, Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Jennifer. But yeah, please, everybody, feel free to reach out to me, phone or email. I'll be happy to take any questions you have or anything I didn't cover today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.